Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined today by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter,
business editor and columnist Greg Jefferson,
investigative reporter / currently doing a stint on the editorial board, Brian Chasnoff.
Right. Everybody's got the longest intro, but that's
everybody's got
my
super
title's
long
cooler.
titles. So.
I don't know what I am anymore.
Yeah, and father of. We're recording this on a Monday morning, and there's breaking news happening in San Antonio as we speak. This morning, the FBI and Texas Rangers raided the far west side office of Bexar County Constable Michelle Barrientos Vela, who, for anyone who's been following the news over the past couple of years, she's had a really eventful first term as Bexar County Constable. And we don't know all the details about, as far as what's being investigated, but there are so many possibilities. And Brian, you've written about some of her activities.
Yeah, the first time I was tipped off to this constable, someone told me that she had extorted money from someone in a county park. And when I did some investigating, the long and short of it is that the county that day had already paid for security to be done. It was Easter, so they needed security that day. But this particular constable was adamant that she wanted to provide security herself. She wanted her office to provide the security at this particular park that was in her precinct.
It was Rodriguez Park, I think. Was it?
Yeah. And then she went out there, and there was a guy at one of the pavilions, and initially she said that she wanted the pavilion for her family. When he started disputing, hey, I've signed up for this a year ago, she said, okay, you have to pay me $50 an hour in order to remain here so that I can provide security for you. Again, even though the county was already paying for security at every park in the county. So that was, redundant for that guy to have to pay that money. So I wrote that column about that, and then that upset actually got a lot of reader response to that.
Right. That
upset a lot of people.
Yeah.
It actually got a lot more reaction to that than I did the follow-up column when she had one of her own deputy constables arrested for I think the charge was falsifying a government record, but the record that she was claiming he had falsified was an EEOC complaint against her. This guy, and this is still going through the courts, but he's claiming that she discriminated against him, that she sexually harassed him.
This was like the Galveston hot tub incident, right?
It's the infamous hot tub incident.
Right.
She claims that he claims that she was harassing him while they were at some conference in Galveston.
Yeah.
And so he filed all these complaints, and he's also running against her for her office. And so she was, in essence, jailing a political opponent on a trumped-up charge that that should not have applied. I mean, this was an EEOC complaint that had not yet been fully adjudicated, and she was claiming everything in it was false, which is that's not how you dispute an EEOC claim. Sorry, I'm getting into opinion. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, well, that's I think you're well within your rights on that one. Anyway, the investigators are probably going to be very busy, and we will know more probably by the time you hear this. We'll know a little bit more. I wanted to move from that issue to to what has been a kind of a growing dispute between Mayor Ron Nirenberg and District 1 Council member Roberto Trevino. We've seen over the past few months that they've been in conflict over the issue of bike lanes, and it relates to a 2017 bond project. $42 million of bond money is earmarked for a project on Lower Broadway, and it's a 3-mile project, and it's the southernmost mile of that project that is really under dispute. Josh, what's going on with this?
So So basically, leave it in.
Yeah, water.
That's right.
That's really gross.
We're gonna
I think that was the oral sort of, it sort of captured, I think, the tension and the conflict that is happening.
Can you speak like that for the entire?
That was.
get
was a
into my
sound-
Nick Nolte voice.
It was a soundscape that kind of captured what we're seeing at City Hall. Okay, no, continue. I'm sorry.
Leave that all in. So for the past 2 months or so, Councilman Trevino and Ron Nirenberg, as you have said, have been going at it basically over to add protected bike lanes to basically it's this like 1.1 mile stretch of Broadway. So basically you've got 281 and 35 where they intersect, everything sort of south of that to about Houston Street or
Right.
so. The mayor wants protected bike lanes that whole way. Councilman Trevino basically says that would be a danger to cyclists. It would slow down car traffic, and it would also make the environment more hostile to pedestrians.
And of course, the part of the issue here is that Broadway really narrows quite a bit from like about 110 feet width to 70 something.
Yeah, about 72 or
yeah.
so.
And so that's part of the reason he's feeling there just isn't going to be room to put protected bike lanes in there.
Right. So, like, the current proposal is to basically take those bike lanes that would be going down Broadway, move them over to
Avenue B.
Move them over to Avenue B, have them cross Broadway at some point, move them over onto Alamo, rather than putting them on Broadway where cars are going, 30, 35, 40 miles an hour.
And I went to, and one point I think is important here, because I've heard some of the people who have been the advocates for bike lanes there on Broadway saying that the Avenue B, this was not part of the bond. Now the funding sources that they're talking about,
They're going outside.
They're
of that.
outside of the bond. I think that's important for people
so
to know.
they're going into the Midtown Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone.
Right.
And I forget the exact amount. I want to say it's about $6 million that they're looking at there. But basically, this kind of all hinges on this idea that this is sort of like the main thoroughfare in San Antonio. If you can't have basically all modes of transportation be present and be accommodated on Broadway, where can you do it?
Yeah.
But at the same time, everybody's kind of pointing fingers at each other going, this would be unsafe, that would be unsafe.
And there was a meeting of the City Council's Transportation and Mobility Committee last week. The chair of the committee, Shirley Gonzalez, like Ron Nirenberg, is very much championing having these bike lanes on Broadway. And there was a presentation, I believe, from the Transportation and Capital Improvements. And what came out of that?
Well, she was, I think it was safe to say she was pretty much infuriated with the city staff. Basically gave kind of like almost like a duplicate presentation that they had given a couple weeks earlier. But basically what staff said was no bike lanes on Lower Broadway. They sided with Councilman Trevino. And basically giving that same sort of line.
And they provided alternatives. They said, here's what would happen if we put bike lanes on Lower Broadway. Yeah. Here's what we would have to sacrifice. And I'm pretty sure in each case, or at least in one case, it would make the cyclists themselves less safe because they would be adjacent to a parking lane on one side of the street. Yeah. But yeah,
it would also make some of the sidewalks narrower.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that they want wide sidewalks, they want landscaping, they want to have via bus service. They don't want to reduce it to 3 lanes of traffic because that would just cause congestion. So they're prioritizing these other things that were also part of the scope of the project. And they're saying, why can't you just be happy routing the cyclists onto these side streets?
And cyclists are still able to use Broadway. It's just not going to be the safest environment for sure.
It's not illegal to go on Broadway.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think one of the things that I hear from people who are in the cycling community is that this feeling, it seems like very much a philosophical or ideological thing more than a design thing. I mean, they'll kind of try to defend their side on the design front, but more of it is about, we never get a fair shake from the cities. We've never gotten the number of miles of protected lanes that we should have. And if we don't stand up for ourselves on Broadway, it's kind of like the slippery slope argument. If we don't stand up for ourselves on Broadway, then what do we
Yeah,
have?
I think it's interesting that, and you saw some of this in Mayor Nirenberg's comments. Like the point is making a point. I mean, this is a matter of principle rather than actually a matter of engineering. Because also you've got a traffic study that recommends moving these bike
And
lanes.
we can say people
elsewhere.
are pointing their fingers at each other, but we can also say that the professionals and the engineers are all saying it
Right.
makes more sense to route them
I mean,
onto Avenue B.
Yeah.
The argument for having bike lanes on Lower Broadway is kind of aspirational. It's like you put them there and you will encourage, it's kind of like social engineering. You're going to encourage more people to cycle to work and that kind of thing. That may be true over time, but what we also know is that there are going to be a bunch of cars, 18,000 a day, going down Broadway.
And
that's a reality.
A lot of people honking horns. If the lanes are reduced.
That's real. I mean, these are things we have to deal with.
And we should know why that will be, because you've got Credit Human that's going to be coming online. You've got Bank of America that's going on sort of north of that 281-35 intersection. You've also got Jefferson Bank that's going to be going in there at some point. You also have, but I mean, this is also kind of an emotional moment for cyclists. You've had two prominent cyclists in the community get killed while riding their bikes. So this is kind of taking on an extra charge.
So why wouldn't they? So it just doesn't seem congruent. You're concerned about safety as a cycling community. Why argue for the less safe option, which is putting lanes on Lower Broadway? It doesn't seem logical. It seems more emotional than logical. And when I asked a cycling advocate that, she's actually the director of bike at San Antonio, she said, "Well, cyclists they're not gonna take another route. So you got to make that safe. They're just not gonna." So I'm not a regular cyclist. I don't know the psychology of like, is it offensive to have to turn?
Yeah, I think that's actually that was somebody I talked to was saying, if say you're going south on Broadway, taking basically the bike lanes would take you down Josephine Street, where people kind of get on 281. They say that's a dangerous intersection, and that would basically endanger them that way, because then they have to go down Avenue B, and then they got to circle back around.
Yeah, but these are all going to be protected bike lanes, and that's another thing is if they're on Lower Broadway, they're not going to be. At least one of the bike lanes won't be protected.
Right. And as you said, it comes down to this idea of like, well, why do we have to be the ones to be rerouted? Why do we get the short end of the stick? And I think it's very much a philosophical thing, as you said, Greg, an aspirational issue. The result of last week's Transportation and Mobility Committee was, there was really no decision on going forward or anything like that. Right?
Councilwoman Gonzalez, she seems to want to take this a little bit further and get more alternatives that aren't just done by Pape Dawson engineers, the folks who have been doing some of the current studies. But I don't know what the appetite is for this on council. They would have to basically set aside money to get another outside expert. They would have to...
or they'd need a council consideration request or something to move the process forward.
Well, one thing that's not clear to me is is this another case where Nirenberg is just unable to articulate an argument for his point of view and bring counsel along with him? Or is this a case where it's like, okay, he's made his point. He doesn't feel strongly enough about it to actually fight for it.
You had city staff recommend against Nirenberg's proposal.
Right.
From when I spoke to the mayor last week, because I wrote an editorial on this weekend, he sounded resigned. His office sounds resigned to the fact that they lost this one. Did you get that impression?
Yeah.
I got that from the mayor, but it sounds like there's some rumbling still from some members on council, but I don't know how this goes forward.
His talk at this point is more like, well, we shouldn't let this happen again after this one, after it happens this time. And of course, he's really created a lot of conflict with Roberto Trevino, who, if you just look at their situations, they should be allies on policy issues, and have probably been on the same side on a lot of things. And it's become a really personal sort of grudge, I guess, between the two of them.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so Trevino represents District 1, which was the best performing district for Nuremberg in both the general election and the runoff. So, I mean, the question will be how much does Trevino really want to fight with the mayor after this issue, or is this it?
Yeah. Another big issue that the council dealt with last week was a proposal from two council members, Jada Andrews Sullivan and John Courage, to create a voluntary gun buyback program in San Antonio using asset forfeiture funds that the city has collected. It went to the governance committee last week and kind of moved through there. So I think public safety is where it'll land next. So, Josh, what do you think the prospects are for this, and how much support do you think this has on the council?
I wonder about that because when you have the police chief coming out and saying, look, I've been in other police departments where we've had this and it didn't work. Yeah, I think that pretty much decides itself. Now, whether they want to go through with it, John Courage seems pretty adamant that, even if this doesn't have any sort of effect on crime rates, like this will be good to get these guns off the streets. But a lot of what they'll be taking up, and we should say that they're talking about at least $250,000 to take out of that fund to go towards this. A lot of what they're going to be doing is, taking up guns that aren't that are broken.
Yeah,
or
that's been the history in other cities.
Right.
You don't get a lot of people turning them in, and when they do, they're turning in just a bunch of old guns that they're not using.
Well, couldn't they just stipulate you have to have at least a criminal record in order to sell guns back to the city?
We're not going to ask about it, but we're going to. We hope. So the mayor seems to be sort of supportive of this. Is that your sense, or at least he seems to be open to the idea?
Yeah, I would say he's open to it. And part of this comes down to they passed a couple weeks ago a resolution calling on the state legislature to take up any sort of like gun violence legislation, calling on Congress to do the same thing. And at the same time they did that, baked into the resolution was like, okay, we've got to look at what we're able to do from our end.
Which is not much.
Yeah. So, when it comes to this particular program, they're kind of exercising what minimal authority they have.
Right. Another way of looking at that is wasting taxpayer money to look like you're doing something to address a really pressing question that actually the city doesn't have much leverage over.
And that studies show don't work and don't get the guns off the streets that you want.
Now, John Courage has kind of said, well, it's more about just a kind of a public safety thing, to kind of prevent accidents for fewer people. But as far as dealing with crime, as you said, there hasn't been much. I think all the studies have suggested that it doesn't really have that effect as far as reducing crime. Now, the asset forfeiture funds are used for public safety. Right. I mean,
right.
The funds that they're talking about using for the gun buyback, these are things that the police department would generally use for equipment and things like that.
And training.
And training. So I think it's easy to see why Chief McManus would not be supportive of this, because this is basically you're taking money that he would probably see as beneficial to the police department in doing their job and putting it into something that just kind of like is a feel-good symbolic thing. Right.
And also, if you take money out in one spot, you might have to make it up somewhere. Although a lot of this is sort of sitting in reserves right now.
Yeah. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit. We had some good economic news last week, and we also had good news at the paper because one of the members of our podcast, one of our favorite people, Greg Jefferson, launched his new column, a weekly column covering business in San Antonio. And Greg, tell us about your first column and what's going on with the.
Okay, well, let's start with the news of last week, which was, it was like, as I said in the column, any way you cut it, it was great news for the city. First, you had Toyota's announcement nearly a week ago that they're going to invest $391 million in their Southside plant, which is fantastic news. although it did not come with any kind of jobs numbers. So like Toyota was very careful to say, hey, this investment is not going to mean X number of new jobs. Part of the reason is because, they're going to be upgrading their production line technology. And what they don't say is what that almost certainly means is more automation, more cutting edge software and robots and cobots, which are robots that kind of work in tandem with human workers. And that's not the kind of investment that's going to spin out 200 or 300 new jobs. But over the long haul, it could mean this plant is ready for a new production line. So they make Tundras and Tacoma pickups at the plant now. Maybe because of this investment, a few years from now, they might bring maybe a forerunner to the plant as well, which could mean more jobs. But it wasn't all just about that investment. You also had ASIN, which is a Toyota supplier. They make transmissions. They announced that they'll be hiring 900 people in Cibolo to run a factory there. They had announced the plant 2 months ago, but they hadn't really said how many workers they were going to hire. So they saved that for the day of the announcement, which is great news also. And then we broke, if I do say so myself, the business section of the Express News broke the news that Navistar International is bringing a $250 million truck plant to San Antonio. Probably, sources are telling us they're looking around Mitchell Lake on the south side. They'll be making commercial trucks there, like delivery vehicles and semis and that kind of thing. They're going to be hiring, I believe I might be off on this, but it's about 600 workers to begin with, and they'll be bringing suppliers as we get closer to the opening date, which they expect to be in about 2 years. They'll be breaking ground later. My column, though, was about it was partly about Mayor Nirenberg's reaction to the Toyota news, which was. This is gigantic. Yeah. This is these are the jobs of the future, and this is huge news, and it is big news. But listening to his comments or reading them, you come away with the impression that advanced manufacturing in San Antonio is one of the big drivers of our economy. And it's not. It's among our 11 jobs categories with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, like manufacturing is number 8 on the list. So it's about 51,000 employees in San Antonio. I mean, I'm not trying to disparage the news from Navistar and Toyota, but we also have to kind of keep it real that it's, manufacturing has never historically been a big deal in San Antonio. And there are some major challenges that Navistar is about to bump up against. Like, we have historically low unemployment rates. It's hard to find workers now. And in San Antonio, it's hard to find semi-skilled and skilled workers. And that's a function of, some problems we've had with education over decades. Right. So unless we're honest with ourselves about, how big an industry is, you're never going to be able to develop policy to address those problems. So that was kind of my point.
And because I'm a horrible person and I think about the political implications of everything, how much of a win, and again, this is obviously about perception, how much of a win is this good news for Mayor Nirenberg?
Oh, it's big. I mean, the interesting thing about Nirenberg's comments was he didn't have to dress it up like that. He didn't have to make manufacturing out to be on the same scale as healthcare or the military. Yeah. It's on its face just great news, but he had to make it like something more, something like epic making, and it's not that. But to me, that kind of shows how desperate he is for an economic development win. I mean, we had some pretty soft job creation numbers over the last couple of years. He got slammed for that during the mayoral race. I think he saw this as an opportunity to rack up some points. He just went he went overboard.
Just maybe overshot it a little
Oh
bit.
yeah, just a little bit.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things up at that point. And thank you for listening. And we will be back next week. Take care.